Hello, hello, hello. All right. Today, this lecture is about, this is our first lecture on the Civil War. All right. So, the key points for the Civil War lectures are causes of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, and the Emancipation Proclamation. All right. So, what we were looking at time frame wise is 1861 to 1865. All right. So, with the impending crisis, we have led us up to the point, almost what it seems like, of no return. All right. So, with this, John J. Crittenden of Kentucky, the man who would replace Henry Clay after Henry Clay retired and was done, Crittenden gave us the Crittenden Compromise. All right. This would come out in 1860. This would push for the 3630 parallel to go all the way out from the Missouri, right below the Missouri, state of Missouri, all the way out to the to the Pacific Ocean in California. And he said everything above it could be free and everything below slave. This would not set well with anybody. By this point, most of the plantation owners in the South wanted everything or nothing because they had been getting it during the impending crisis. Hopefully, you've noticed that. With our impending crisis lecture, everything that they wanted, they got during the 1850s. So, this compromise seemed there's no reason to have it. They wanted their way, and they thought they would get it. All right. And like we did with the end of the 1850s lecture, the impending crisis lecture, we talked about with the election of Abraham Lincoln, they panicked because they thought the Republicans were completely and solely about anti-slavery. And quite a few of them were. So, what would happen with this? With Lincoln being elected, with John Brown having conducted his raid on Harper's Ferry, with everything that had happened in the 1850s, and then it seemed to be turning around in the other direction, they turned. They decided that the only way they could keep the America that they knew was with secession. All right. So, you have one after the other. From December of 60 through, through spring of 61, southern states seceding. It goes South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. But remember, you also have the Nevada Territory and South. Both of those territories were pro-slave and went with the South as well. So you have this missing South that starts to secede really quickly and continues on into that next year. So, before we get into the war itself, I want to talk about your first key point. Your first key point is causes of secession. All right. And in the end, what is the causes of the Civil War? All right. So, we have quite a few. All right. They have been pushed and promoted and talked about for a long time. All right. People have said from the very beginning its sources of difference. Right? And you can refer to the Old South lecture in the White Old South, where we talked about all kinds of different ways of thought, all kinds of different ways of living. All right. And that's a part of it. You also have, of course, economics. I mean, when in American history has economics not played a huge role in shaping who we are? So, what you have is this idea of an industrial world and an agricultural world. But these two push different ways. You know, in the North, they push paid labor. And like we talked about when we were in this idea of the peculiar institution and propaganda, the idea that the North was taking advantage of and abusing people. It's true, and it's horrible. And this is something that we would address on through the 1800s and into the 20th century. And now we should address again because it's horrific. People with money are taking advantage of people. Also, that doesn't take away from the fact that the agrarian economy that was based on slavery did this same exact thing. It was horrific. The institution of racial slavery, using them to do the same thing. So, in essence, what you really should look at and how it should be perceived is that both sides were taking huge, just taking advantage of people. So, we have both the industrial and the agrarian, people with money taking advantage of those that have nothing. Has been throughout American history and continues on. Has been throughout world history and continues on. This is one of the things I think that we need to focus on now and into the future. Something that we need to look at and see how this system then and now takes advantage of people. All right, next, it's politics. All right, politics from the very beginning until this present day, one of the oldest arguments in American history is states' rights versus nationalism, or if you want to refer to it a different way, federalism. Should the states have power or should the nation have power? And what should we consider to be a compromise, right? So, from the very beginning, we have this with the anti federalist, the federalist, the idea of states' rights or people's rights versus national solidity. Or this idea of the nation can protect the individual people's rights so we can keep away from individual monarchies. All right. So, this idea of states' rights versus nationalism has been from then to now, because now we're still arguing over big government, little government, big government, which is the right way to go. This is something that has been around since the beginning of America. And truth be told, both sides, both groups want to protect the individuals, the people of America, from being controlled. So, this argument, states' rights, nationalism, either way you look at it, these two groups want the same thing. They're trying to accomplish the same things, but they want to get to the same thing in different ways. And I think this is very important for everybody to see and everybody to understand, because the idea is of the utmost importance to both groups, to all Americans. Americans, whether they're left or right, want that same goal. This idea, this goal of freedom, this goal of making a better world for all Americans. And this is one of the things I have seen, and one of the things that persist through the 1800s and into the 20th century, that I think that people have strived for. This idea of working. In the end, you have to work together. In the end, the people have to work together to create this. If you're split, if you hate each other, it's not going to happen. It never will happen. We have to stay focused on the true goal, the real goal. This idea of the freedom of people. Both want this, both have fought for this, and unfortunately, both sides have corrupted themselves in trying to push this, that they are the only way. All right? So, you get my opinion on the politics. So, we've talked about the sources of difference between the two. We've talked about economics of the two. We've talked about politics. And we're going to go back to a blundering generation. All right. Remember, I was telling you guys and talking to you guys about, and really going over this, how the Dunning School pushed a new line of thinking. They are the ones that created the Old South myth And they kept going with this idea that the planters in the Old South were the true America. And this had promoted a racist America for a long time. There's that. Where that comes from is what I'm about to talk about. All right. So, by the 1880s and 90s of the 1800s, which we'll talk about next semester if you join me in that class, what we've got is this idea that what we call now a blundering generation. What people of the Dunning School and all of those guys said, look, the South was the true America that pushed the lost cause, that pushed the South would rise again, that the true way of America was Southern. Was hitting so hard in the 80s and 90s that the North and the West and everybody else that didn't agree with them just gave up. They were tired of fighting. They didn't care. They didn't want the same thing. All right? But they were at that point where they said, I'm tired of fighting with these people. I just want to let go. And they did. Hence the Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel Tilden election, which is what we're going to end this semester with. All right? But this idea of a blundering generation that would come after that, after this election of 1876, the whole idea was, it's like, neither side was wrong. Both sides had faults. Both had issues. Both were fighting with each other. But what was the cause of this war was a blundering generation. The kids that came about after the Henry Clays, after Daniel Webster, after John C. Calhoun, after all these major leaders, presidents, and otherwise had come about, these kids couldn't stop the idea of radicalism. So it was their fault. These kids screwed up. These kids were the reason that the Civil War happened. It's an excuse. It's a very lame excuse. These kids grew up in America. They grew up with an education. They grew up in an environment where they were better educated and knew what was going on than any other generation before them. But this idea is pushed by the previous generation. The previous generation that has two distinct views, that want certain things, and these kids, they're the reason it happens. All right. It should be established. This is lame. The past is what caused this, not the current generation. All right. So, we've gone through quite a few of the causes of of secession. All right. So what we're going to wrap up with is the final and in truth the real reason for secession. We're going to talk about slavery. I know that you guys and others have heard numerous times. You still hear it. It's still out there that there was numerous causes for secession. And I just gave you a lot of them. But the key cause, the main cause, is slavery. Racial slavery. All right. So, let's get into it. All right. I mentioned South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, so on and so on, with secession. The key to remember is why they seceded, why they saw they seceded, and all of those things do play a part. But what we're going to do is talk about, and I'm going to read to you why the South seceded, because Southerners gave their Declaration of Independence, which they called, the reasons for secession or causes of secession. So what we're going to go with is the very first Southern state that seceded from the Union, South Carolina. All right. With this, all right. This happens on December the 20th, 1860. And this would lead, in the end, to the South instigating, in other words, starting the Civil War when South Carolinians would attack Fort Sumter. All right. So, here is the declaration of causes of secession. In the present case, that fact is established with certainty. We assert that 14 of the states have deliberately refused for years past to fulfill their constitutional obligations. We refer to their own statutes for proof. The Constitution of the United States, in its 4th article, provides as follows: no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping to another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. All right. So right there, with this Declaration of Secession, which the South looked at as a declaration, of Independence. They see things in the right and in the form and as what they see as America through the Constitution itself, which supports it, that slavery is legal, should be enforced, and if it is not, which they say has happened, they can secede because they are the true followers of the Constitution. All right. So, with this, I think it's very important for everybody to see this. This is the idea and the push of the South, that the whole idea of the Constitution was to protect rights. And the only reason that the Southerners agreed to that was due to that fourth article of the Confederation, where everyone else agreed that they could have slaves and that they would protect that right. So, this is why South Carolina seceded and went rogue. This is why Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and out in the West, the Nevada and New Mexico territories. This is why they pushed and went to secession. Because in the Constitution, though it didn't state slavery outright, it pushed and promoted and said outright that everyone would defend it. By this point, Americans in the Northwest and even in the South, like the Grimke sisters, weren't okay with that. Americans weren't okay with letting this keep going. They thought it was wrong. They thought it was evil. They wanted to get rid of it and start something new. Right? And with this, you can see how, just like the Bible, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, anything that people consider a living document, it changes with the times. All men are considered equal. All men are equal. Nowadays, we see that as all mankind, everyone should be equal. This starts with us. This starts in the 1800s. This starts in the late 1800s in what would become the Civil War. All right. So, with that, we've got all of these issues. We've got all of these problems. And the South starts pushing for secession. And All the states do this. But here's the kicker. Here's the really fascinating point, the fascinating story that gets left out. Not everybody agrees in the South. Remember, we talked about the myth of the Old South, and we talked about how that those elite, how the people at the top of that pyramid created and kept pushing that South and controlled from the local, state, regional, and national level. But people didn't necessarily agree with that. And where you live, we didn't agree with that. My grandfather's, my grandfather, his great grandfather was one of the few people, was one of the people that created the first Alabama cavalry, which fought on the side of the Union. This whole Northwest Alabama was pro-Union throughout the war, before and after. And throughout the South, you get this. North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina. All of these places had huge populations that didn't want to secede, that were pro-Union. But the group, the place that set the standard that the Confederates would follow would be South Carolina. South Carolina was the only state, only place of the Confederacy that voted unanimously for secession. They voted for secession unanimously because anybody that refused to, they hung. And this went all the way up to the planters. Anybody and everybody was held to this standard. If you were not pro-Confederacy, pro-slavery, above the Union, you would be killed. So, when South Carolina voted for secession, they had already killed numerous prominent South Carolinians. So everyone voted for secession. And they would push this through the rest of the South. All right? With this whole idea of secession, no matter what, would grow. But, like I said, in Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Missouri, all of these places would have large groups that disagreed and refused to secede. And in all these places, they would foment their own rebellions against the idea of Confederacy. But at the same time, as the Northern Army would come through, they would fight them too. All right. The prime example of this, one of the big keys in Southern history was showing how people didn't focus on and didn't like being told what to do, is Winston County, right here in Northwest Alabama. They refused the Confederacy. They refused the Union. And anytime either group would come into that area, they would fight them no matter who. They fought for their way of life. They didn't want any outsiders telling them anything to do. Right? So one of the things you'll see in this time, if you go to the Civil War lecture and go to the slide of what I refer to as the state of Nickajack. This is eastern Tennessee going into and through all of North Alabama. When at the beginning of this war, Tennessee, Alabama seceded, eastern Tennessee and northern Alabama refused to leave. They sent representatives to Congress stating that they wanted to stay in the Union and please accept them as a state. They wanted to be accepted as the state of Nickajack. They were not Southern Confederate. They were Southern pro-Union. But Lincoln and Congress couldn't allow this to happen because they refused to allow the idea that the Southern states had the right to secede. So what that means is that all the Southern states that seceded, the Union had to outright reject as a possibility. So that this new group that came to them that wanted to create a new state in the Union couldn't be allowed to happen because they didn't recognize that Tennessee and Alabama left the Union. So with this, you see the true confusion that is going on, that has happened, between the causes of secession and the Civil War, with the sources, with the blundering, with the economics, with the politics, and most importantly, slavery. You also get, how the southern states that do secede and control their people focus on the idea of secession because they have to protect slavery. So with this, you guys and gals get the background of what will become and what is the Civil War. All right. With this is what I'm going to end our first Civil War lecture on. Good night. Good luck. Stay safe and stay happy. And